Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's Hotel Investors Marketplace webcast produced by Hotel Brokers International. I am Brandt Niehaus, President of HBI and President of Huff, Niehaus & Associates, Inc. in Louisville, Kentucky. I will be moderating today's webinar. The title is U.S. Hotel Operation Issues, including Extreme Minimum Wage Proposals, Resort Fees and Other Service Fees, and Airbnb. So we have three topics to discuss today, and we welcome you for joining us. While everyone is getting signed in and comfortable, we'll highlight a selection of HBI member listings on the screen, and I'll share a few items with you. Founded 57 years ago in 1959, Hotel Brokers International is the leading network of real estate brokers specializing exclusively in hotel real estate investments, providing every phase of the brokerage process from property valuation to closing. You can visit HBI on the web at www.hbihotels.com. If at any time during this webcast you have a question, just click on the Ask a Question button located at the top of the webcast player. Type in your question and submit it. We'll answer as many questions as our time allows. We have also included some attachments. Links are under the Attachments button. In these attachments are the three reports that we are going to review that were conducted by Penn State. We'll be discussing them in detail with Dr. John O'Neill, who headed the study. They'll also be available later today on the recorded event and when it is posted on the demand viewing at hbihotels.com. We want you to let us know how we're doing and rate today's webcast by clicking on the Rate This button, also located at the top of the webcast player. I'll remind you of this at the end of the webcast. Please feel free to share this webcast by clicking the Share This button with your other colleagues and business associates. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. John O'Neill. Dr. O'Neill currently serves as Professor and Director of the Center for Hospitality Real Estate Strategy at the Pennsylvania State University, better known to some of us as Penn State. During his 14-year career at Penn State, Dr. O'Neill has generated over $1 million in research grant funding, scholarship, and gift endowments, funding for facilities, and professional consulting revenues. In addition, Dr. O'Neill has served as a term as Director of the School of Hospitality Management, as Chair of multiple doctoral committees, and on the editorial board of top hospitality journals such as Real Estate Editor, a leading hotel industry professional trade magazine, and as President of his local chapter of the Appraisal Institute and Chairman of his local planning commission. Welcome, John. How are you today?
Doing well, Brandt. Thank you.
We just saw each other last week in Los Angeles at the Alice conference. There was a lot of buzz about the Airbnb study. Seemed like about every other session I went to, somebody was talking about it, even on the podium, not just in the audience. So it'll be interesting to hear that later in our webcast. Let's just start with the wage, extreme minimum wage report. For those in the audience, this is the ICHRIE Penn State research report conducted on extreme minimum wages and the effects on the U.S. hotel industry. John, maybe you could just tell us a little bit how this came about, and we'll start there and then get into the premise of what took place in the study.
Yeah, sure, Brandt. And you mentioned ICHRIE, and ICRE is the International Council on Hotel, Restaurant, and Institutional Education.
Okay.
And it's the academic body that those of us who are hotel school professors belong to. And they reviewed and published this study, so I just thought I'd mention that because it is actually a peer-reviewed study. And so it's gone through the rigor of that. And so that suggests it has some level of validity to it. And so I just wanted to point that out because you mentioned ICRE, but I'm guessing there may be people who don't know what ICRE is. But that's
yeah, I'm sure the majority of our audience does not know what that acronym stands for.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that.
That's what it is, and it's a big driver in academic research and collegiality. And I completed this work with a doctoral student of mine, former doctoral student of mine, and we were basically trying to answer a question that kept coming to us about extreme minimum wage proposals that we had heard about. And the question really was, what would be the economic impact of an increase in the overall federal minimum wage to $10.10 an hour, which President Obama and many people in Congress had been promoting. And so that was ultimately the goal, was to figure out what is that impact.
How did you go about determining that effect? Through other reports, research of your own? How did you accomplish getting some of the statistics behind the report?
We conducted a literature review, and we looked at, because there had not been a precedent for such a thing in the United States, we looked at other areas where extreme minimum wages had actually been enacted and looked at what were the impacts in those other areas. So, for example, we noted that in Russia there was an extreme minimum wage and it was enacted, and we looked at what sort of effects that had on the economy. And that allowed us to then look at what would be the variables or factors that may be affected by an extreme minimum wage enactment in the United States as well. And so it allowed us to figure out, specifically in our case focused on the hotel industry, how it would impact the hotel industry.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's just talk in general, maybe about minimum wage and what occurs when that's increased. Minimum wage rate today is $7.25. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. That's the federal minimum wage, although there are a number of states now that have higher minimum wages, and there's some municipalities that have higher minimum wages as well. And so our focus in our study was on the increase in the federal minimum wage to $10.10 an hour. But it's a good point that you raised, that federal minimum wage is the absolute minimum wage nationwide, but there are in fact already a number of higher minimum wages in different locations around the country.
Well, I mean, as I read through the report, the thing that occurred to me is that I'm not sure how many jobs are still at $7.25, because in the typical hotel, most of what everybody considered to be a minimum wage job 15 years ago, hotel operators are having to pay more than that to get good quality front desk people and maintenance people and housekeepers. So it may be a starting point for some housekeepers, but and I'm just relating to the hotel business because that's what business we're in. But this would affect other industries as well, and my guess is there's probably a lot of other businesses that aren't paying $7.25 any longer. So would the effect really be that significant?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. I think the effect would be significant from the standpoint of dollars because there still are people at that level. And what would happen is that other areas where, you might not do work where the minimum wage is still predominantly used, that have relatively low cost as a competitive advantage, either in terms of doing business, such as owning hotels, or in terms of attracting vacationers and tourists and conventioneers to their area, that's a competitive advantage that they would lose. So the impact would not be even. It would have less impact on major metropolitan areas, for example, than it would on more rural areas where there are hotels as well.
Right, sure. In general, what did you find to be, probably in your study with the Russian report or any other that pertain to the total U.S. economy as a whole, What transpires when you have a increase in wage? You know, when it jumps, I mean, it seems pretty significant to go from 7.25 to 10.10. What are some of the aspects that, you know, affect the economy, whether it's, you know, for hotels, just in general?
Yeah, well, yeah, certainly in general, it has a lot of impacts as far as employment goes. And even the work that the Congressional Budget Office did showed that going to 10.10 an hour, and even going to a lower wage in the $9 an hour range would have a significant negative effect on jobs. So there are still jobs that are at that level. And the challenge is that every worker is not worth $10.10 an hour. And so that person who gets the opportunity, like you mentioned, you know, maybe housekeepers starting out at the minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, you have a chance to show what they can do, and after maybe as quick as 90 days, they're making more than $7.25 an hour. But the $7.25 an hour is the foot in the door for somebody like that. And in some cases, that person hasn't been in the workforce for a while, or hasn't been in the workforce ever because they're young and perhaps they're a full-time student. So what would happen is the opportunities for those people would be lessened. And so we concur with what the Congressional Budget Office concluded, which is that there would be a negative effect on overall employment. So in hotels, to kind of look at a micro level, what I think would ultimately happen is that there would be fewer people working in hotels, with more productive people who are worth $10.10 an hour or more. And then existing employees who are maybe making higher than the minimum wage, making maybe $8 or $9 or $10 an hour, their wages would go up as well. So it's not like everybody in the hotel would suddenly be earning $10.10 an hour, because there are some people with some levels of skills and training that are worth more than the minimum wage, whatever it is. And so they would see an increase beyond the $10.10 range. So essentially what we think would happen is that there would be fewer employees. So because of that, there would be less economic impact from the wages of somebody who's young and just starting out or just returning to the workforce. And that impact, ultimately, when you look at it on a national basis, it would be significant in terms of dollars.
Mm-hmm. What happens to pricing? I mean, it seems to me that with a wage increase, it, you know, obviously forces businesses and hotels to raise their prices to try to cover some of that cost. What effect does that have?
Yeah, it's a good question, because we have seen that in other areas where what happens is prices, in fact, do go up. And we've seen that already in a micro level in the United States, such as in California, for example. So it would mean increased prices to cover the costs. And basically what we think is that the model of a ideal hotel, so to speak, would be a slightly higher priced but slightly lower occupancy hotel. And so because of that, it would mean reduced revenue in some other areas, like, for example, in food and beverage and in ancillary parts of hotels. So the overall hotel revenue that comes from these ancillary functions would be reduced because of that. And then because of the fewer guest rooms occupied, there'd be less trickle-down effect through the economy in terms of money spent on supplies and other things in hotels.
Yeah, the one thing as it is today, where they've had these pockets of increased minimum wage. I mean, there's municipalities across the country that have voted a higher minimum wage. I got to believe that puts the hotels in that market at a competitive disadvantage, because they almost have to raise rates. So as in this report, it's sort of drastic difference, a Biloxi kind of destination community versus Los Angeles. But in either case, that the increase in wages makes Biloxi, and pricing, makes Biloxi less attractive than Gulfport, Mobile, or some other Gulf Coast community that does a lot of the same type business.
Yeah, exactly. A place like Biloxi would be affected to a greater extent than other areas in terms of the negative impact, because it would lose its great competitive advantage in other cities in the Gulf. And that is something that has attracted people, and it results in employment. So it would have a negative effect, because what would happen is it would lose much of the competitive advantage, and so people would go to New Orleans or other parts of the Gulf area, because if they're going to be paying relatively high prices,
why not go to New Orleans? Yeah,
exactly. Why not go to New Orleans? Right.
Right. You also mentioned the outcome could, slow hotel construction in local areas.
It would affect the economics, because ultimately what it would mean is that the overall profitability of hotels would be less. And because of that, it's going to slow construction, and we think that there would be a loss in hotel values, just all other things being equal. In other words, absent any economic growth. And that is important to note, that in our report we made, because we really have to make in an economic impact analysis like this, an assumption that things remain. We're not assuming there's great economic growth or a great recession. But what we're saying is, at a point in time when you see such a wage increase, what happens? And by our calculations, it has an effect of lowering hotel construction, and then the trickle-down effect of that in terms of construction jobs and materials, and it would result in a loss in hotel values because of reduced profitability as well.
Well, you mentioned earlier about occupancy changing. Having been out at Alice last week, I noticed in the different pundits, whether it's STR, PKF, or any of them, talking about where we were in 2015 and where we're going in 2016. Occupancies have been growing. They grew 2.4%, I think, in 2015, but the projection for 2016 is only 1.9. So even without this minimum wage, it would appear just the general economy is slowing the occupancy growth in hotels, which made me think, if you have increase in wages and increase in pricing, that too could maybe exasperate that 1.9 and become no growth nationwide. I don't know what the effect would be. I'm not sure how people like STR and PKF come up with 2.4 versus 1.9, but wouldn't it, in fact, it's bound to have some effect, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Because really, if you look at the overall macro forecast for economic growth for the U.S., it suggests that what the folks at CBRE and PwC and everyone was saying at Alice last week is that we're still seeing growth in 2016, but it's at a lower rate of increase than it was in 2015 and 2014. So it looks like, from the standpoint of the overall growth curve, that we're growing, but at a lower rate, so that we're nearing the peak. And whether the peak will be in 2016 or 2017 or whenever, I don't think there's any way anyone really knows for sure, but it looks like because of that deceleration, we're getting to that point. And something like this, something like a wage increase at that point, could have a significant effect.
Right. Yeah, it's one thing to have an increase when you're at the beginning of an upturn. It's a little different when you're near the peak, and things can turn sour faster.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the other things that I saw in the study was it indicated that higher minimum wage leads to increased turnover, increased stress, and increased health issues. Can you explain a little bit what your findings were there?
Yeah, what we looked at is, in other places where this happened, what occurred when minimum wages increased. We saw other effects, and there's social effects as well. So if you look at employment, employment is something that provides somebody with a sense of pride and a sense of accomplishment. And absent that, it's absent that sense of well-being as well. So when we've seen other areas where minimum wages have increased, what's happened is the people at the low level, somebody who doesn't have significant amounts of work experience either at all or for a long period of time, they're not able to be a part of the workforce. And so that's one thing that happens. And then the other thing that happens that we noted is what operations tend to do is they tend to go with more full-time people. So when minimum wages increase, that person who really wants to work part-time, maybe because they're a single mom or maybe because they're handicapped, for all sorts of social reasons, somebody might want to work part-time because they have other jobs or other responsibilities or just other things that they do with their life. That person has fewer opportunities in the workplace as well. So what ends up occurring is there's this bottom layer of people in the workforce without a lot of skills, without a lot of training, and without a lot of experience who generally get cast aside. And so the social impacts on that group of people are very negative because ultimately, the way it works in an economy is, and again, this is more profound in a rural area than, say, in a place like New York City, but what happens in an economy then is that there's certain people who do get cast aside, and it's because they're not worth $10.10 an hour to the market, and because of that, they don't have opportunities to work, and because of that, there's great social costs, and there's economic costs as well, because then there's unemployment compensation and probably some sort of health care compensation for those people as well.
Yeah, it seems to me you mentioned earlier about how in cases of increased minimum wage, their businesses will begin to maybe lay off some of those workers and put a little more work onto the salary or full-time people and just expect more out of them, which it's probably where that stress and turnover comes into. I don't know if that's where it comes in or not.
No, you're right. Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the stress, and I mean, part of the turnover is because some people are unable to enter the workforce, but part of it is because people in the workforce have a higher workload. And, we always see that when jobs are cut, that those who remain are fortunate to have a job, but then the level of responsibilities and stress for those people tends to increase as well. And so that's what we think would happen in this case.
The study also sort of addressed what, are some of the benefits of minimum wage. Maybe you could just, highlight those, because having been in the business world long enough to remember when we had the last minimum wage increase, I do remember there were some benefits for people, and maybe you can just explain where those might be.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly are benefits of having a minimum wage, and I think that it's important to note that what seems to be handled well by the economy, because you remember the last time the minimum wage increased, when there's relatively small increases to the minimum wage over a long period of time, the economy seems to be able to absorb it. It's when there's suddenly a shock of a big increase in the minimum wage that the economy seems to have a difficult time absorbing it. But yeah, in terms of the minimum wage, ultimately it's designed to allow people to have what's euphemistically called a living wage. So to be able to work and actually have a home and not be on public assistance and have that pride of not being on public assistance and having a job and doing that job well. So there's social benefits and there's economic benefits to having a minimum wage as well. The issue is more when it increases, because perhaps it should increase, or perhaps it should be more of a regionalized or localized minimum wage rather than one minimum wage nationally. But whatever the ideal situation is, whether it's regional or local, the point is that the economy is able to absorb small increases, and because of that, somebody who's currently earning $7.25 or $7.50 an hour and maybe going up to $7.75 or something like that, they're way less likely to lose their job. So the social benefits are much more positive, as well as the economic ones.
Well then, and I think this was said in the report, it sounds as though, based on your study, that rather than doing a jump from 7.25 to 10.10, some kind of gradual increase of the minimum wage may be a more positive way of adjusting the minimum wage. Is that correct?
Yeah, that'd be my takeaway. Either that situation where there's some rather gradual and perhaps legislated over a course of multiple years into the future, but gradual increases to the minimum wage, or minimum wages that are more localized at some level, municipally or on a state basis, which has really begun to happen already as well. And so there's probably multiple ways to get to what I think a lot of people would like to see in terms of benefiting the overall country, the economy, and the social aspect of the country.
In the minimum wages that you use to compare Biloxi versus New Orleans versus the national, was that a minimum wage number based on hotel employment or just general minimum
wage? It was
wage
based on hotel employment, yeah. So comparing Biloxi to New Orleans, the whole idea was to show that the impact of an increased minimum wage is uneven. It's not like it's exactly the same in city to city to city or area to area. That there's places that would disproportionately be negatively affected, and Biloxi was one of those places that I hypothesized you would see that kind of a condition. Right.
And based on that part of the study, it seemed to me obvious that the more rural areas would be, and tertiary markets would be the most affected. And yet, standard of living in New Orleans or nationally is probably higher. But I think what the results would end up being is you'd end up with inflation, especially in those small markets. Because if it's across the board of minimum wage, and you're going from one standard, I didn't do the percentage, but it's probably what 25% increase at least. Everybody's going to be increasing prices. I don't care whether it's McDonald's or whatever in those markets.
Oh yeah, well yeah, going from 725 to 1010 is a 39% increase.
Is that what it is?
And
okay.
Yeah, so it's significant, whereas past minimum wage increases have been usually in the single-digit percent, but multiple increases over the course of multiple years. So that's why this proposal was kind of shocking, because we thought, oh my gosh, we haven't seen this happen in the U.S. We've seen it happen in some small localized areas, and we've seen it happen in other countries. And what happened was a lot of stuff where I think ultimately what we found is the markets are smarter than the legislators. And so legislators say, oh, we want everyone to earn $10.10 an hour. Won't that be great for the country? Well, the fact is, what happens, in fact, is some people lose jobs who aren't worth $10.10 an hour. And then they're dealing with, like you said, in a place like Biloxi, there's going to be some level of inflation if wages have increased by 39%. So then those people at the bottom of the economy, who the market has determined are not worth $10.10 an hour, they lose jobs, but they're faced with great inflation, and they still have to spend money and probably have to spend more money to get the things they need to live. So what happens, and we've seen this in other places, is it creates a large underground economy, because those people will still do something to earn money. It's just they won't do it legally. So what happens is under the table work increases. And so they're making whatever they can under the table, may not even be $7.25 an hour. And then on top of that, they're not getting protections like workers' compensation, and probably not getting any health care benefits, at least through their employment as well. So the economy adjusts because the economy is smart that way. And I don't think that the legislators have necessarily, thought through it in an intelligent way like the economy would tend to react. So, some legislators have, but those who are promoting 39% increase probably have not.
Well, let's try to conclude this. I'll just ask you to, in a quick synopsis, give us, your conclusions from the report, the 2 or 3 big bullet points you guys got out of this.
Yeah, sure. What we found in conclusion is that, based on our economic impact analysis, that increasing the federal minimum wage from $7.25 to $10.10 an hour would have effects on the U.S. hotel industry in terms of reducing overall guest room revenue, reducing food and beverage revenue, resulting in fewer guest rooms being occupied, resulting in less money being spent for supplies. There'd be a loss in housekeeping and food and beverage staff because, for example, some hotel operations with food and beverage would just simply stop, or significantly reduce them. So they may reduce or eliminate room service, for example, because it's not highly profitable anyway, and at a higher wage it's worse. Or they convert their restaurants to grab and go, which would be less employment. And then the things we talked about before, like loss in hotel values, and then the resulting lower occupancy taxes collected and lower corporate taxes paid. And it would be an impact of $2.53 billion, a negative impact of $2.53 billion on the U.S. hotel industry. So it's significant.
Pretty significant, yeah. Pretty significant. Well, I appreciate that. Let's move on to the resort fees and service fees within the U.S. hotel industry. As I read the report, I mean, for those who travel to destinations, it's usually where they find them. It's only about 7% of the hotels that actually charge resort fees, but it is I think, exasperating for some consumers when they get hit with these and they thought they priced the room at one level, and then they get there and find out there's another 25% charge or whatever the number is.
Right.
How did this report come about?
This report came about because we had seen some pretty alarming headlines in news articles based on a study that came out from New York University that said that resort fees and other charges totaled $2.47 billion in the American hotel industry in 2015. And so there were these media headlines that said things like hidden hotel resort fees are not going away anytime soon, and painted them as a very negative thing. And while there's certainly a negative side to it, I think we felt that there's two sides to the story, and probably both sides needed to be told.
Mm-hmm. Fees, are resort fees something that a consumer has to pay when they check in? Because my understanding is the resort fees cover, ancillary facilities that, these big full-service hotels have that other select service or, for sure, limited service properties do not. Is it an optional thing, or is it the consumers feeling pressed because they have to pay this whether they use it or not?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. What we found is that at the hotels that have them, they are, as you said, they're generally limited to destination-type markets. So it's not typically transient hotels, and it's certainly not usually select service or limited service hotels.
Right.
It's usually large, full-service resort hotels, and it's very common in particular markets. So we found, for example, in Orlando and Las Vegas, you're very likely to see them, whereas in most other markets, you're not. And so, as you said, if you look at it on a national basis, it's only about 7% of hotels in the U.S. that charge resort fees. But specifically to get to your point about mandatory, within those 7%, it is generally mandatory. In other words, if you're staying at one of those properties, usually you do pay resort fees. And there are some exceptions. So, for example, if a large resort hotel needs to charge no or lower resort fees to a particular group because they, with their negotiations with that group, the group convinces the hotel operator that they're not going to use the recreational facilities, or they're not going to use the business facilities, or something like that. With those exceptions, at that 7% of hotels that have resort fees, people who stay there do pay the resort fees.
I guess when I think about it, of course, maybe I look at it differently. I'm usually traveling without the family. But
yeah.
When you go to events that are at these destinations, most of those ancillary services aren't, I'm not an exercise guy, so I don't use the fitness center, restaurants and that, or whatever extras that they're charging. A bottle of water in your room, doesn't seem worth the $4 or $8, and so it just seems to me that it would be good if these fees were optional, and you could say, well, I'm not going to use those services. But what you're saying is they are mandatory in the 7% that
yeah, right. That's what we generally found. There are, again, I said we did find cases where they're optional, such as for certain groups. Or
well, yeah, if it got negotiated out for a group, but I'm just thinking of the individual
right.
consumer going online to go to Las Vegas or whatever. They're going to have to pay it.
Yeah, and that's ultimately a decision at the operation level that is that what they want to do. So, for example, in your case, if you're not using the recreational facilities and you're paying the resort fee, they have to understand going in that they are making a decision where there are going to be some guests like you who are going to say, well, okay, I understand this, and maybe it was even communicated to me, but I don't feel like I should pay it, and therefore, they're going to have to deal with either negotiating with that person individually to reduce or eliminate the fee, or deal with the negativity that guest feels, and possibly that person getting onto social media and stating how they feel as well. So it's a decision they have to make at the unit level whether it is reasonable for their market and their customers and their location to have resort fees.
Was there any conclusions in the study that would advise those 7% hotels of how they should manage their service fees? Was that a part of the study at all?
I would say the study focused more on to what extent are they being charged, what are they being charged for, and why are they being charged. So just to provide a little bit of balance to the discussion, so it's understanding that there are consumers who actually prefer what's known as partition pricing, and partition pricing being a situation where you have a price that's actually broken out, and so the customer can see what are the different components of the price. So airlines do that, for example, and rental cars do that, for example. So there's a lot of providers who do that. I work in education, and we actually do that. In our semester bills to our students, we break out what's tuition and what's room and what's board and what's technology fees and other things as well. So partition pricing is something that exists in the hotel industry, or at least in 7% of the hotel industry, but it exists in a lot of other aspects of the hospitality and travel industries, and it exists in a lot of other industries as well.
Mm-hmm. And so it's really just more of a way of informing the consumer what their money's going towards. I mean, they still end up paying whatever the bill is to go to Penn State. They're still going to pay that bill whether they say it's all-inclusive or they do it broken out, but people like to know what they are paying for, right?
That's right. I mean, there are consumers who prefer that. What we found is there's some consumers who prefer partition pricing and some who don't. And, it depends on the consumer, it depends on the situation, and it depends on what the market is doing. So whether it's optimal, say for us at Penn State University, to charge extra fees for room and board and technology and other things on top of tuition, that may be debatable. But specifically in terms of the hospitality industry, what we found is that some consumers prefer that type of partition pricing and some don't. And so it's a decision that an operator has to make given their market in terms of who their guests are and what their location is. Because in some locations it's customary, as we talked about, like Orlando and Las Vegas, it's become customary and most operators do it. If you were an operator in a non-resort location and you tried to do it, my guess is you'd probably see more resistance. So although the study didn't get really into this type of recommendation, my recommendation for an operator in that type of a location would be really to think twice about it, because in that case it may be seen as a competitive disadvantage.
Mm-hmm. So I'll give you a minute or so to just tell us the conclusions you saw out of the report and share that with the audience.
Yeah, so what we found is that, as we said, about 7% of U.S. hotels charge resort fees, and they're mainly limited to resort hotels in certain markets. The concept of partition pricing exists in that part of the hotel business, that's 7% of the hotel business. And we found that in other aspects of the hospitality and travel industries as well, including in rental cars and in airlines. We also found it in other industries, like, for example, in banking and cell phones and education, that was a fairly common practice as well. And ultimately, it's common and appropriate and preferred by consumers as well as businesses in particular types of transactions, and it may include certain types of hotel transactions. But ultimately, what I think is that while there's cases that customers prefer partition pricing, there's cases where they don't prefer that as well, and different operators ultimately have different practices based on the marketplaces where they operate and the consumers who they serve.
My sense is that it, like a lot of things, becomes market driven, and if all of Las Vegas is charging these fees and they're doing them as partition pricing, and that's working, unless one casino or hotel finds that an all-inclusive sells better, they're going to probably continue to do it, whatever works in the marketplace, right?
Yeah, I think so. And you raise a good point too, because we've looked at kind of one side of the question, which is partition pricing to maybe a more extreme than average level, but there are cases of even less extreme where it is all-inclusive, as you said, where it's room and food and beverage and everything included. And what we found is that that's a fairly small minority. I mean, probably, you and I have both been to all-inclusive properties, and if you're going to feel like, well, I'm getting my value for paying for my food and paying for my beverage in advance, I like it, but if I don't want that, then, that may not be to my advantage. So there are, again, very small percentage of operators who've gone the other direction and just said, we're going to charge one fee for everything, and then we don't have to focus on monitoring, does somebody use the health club, and does somebody use the bar, and does somebody use the restaurant. So there are cases, there are markets, and again, it's interesting at that other extreme end, it's particularly resort properties, but there are cases where that makes sense given the patrons who are staying there.
I think that those seem to work best in the vacation locations where people are just consuming as much as they can, and they think they'll get a deal by having it all loose.
Right. Yeah, they're just cutting loose. They're cutting loose for whatever period of time
right.
they're there. If you're going to Chicago and staying at a Sheraton, you don't want that.
No. All right. Well, let's move on to probably the hottest topic, although all three of them are important topics, but Penn State conducted this analysis of the other side of Airbnb, and it seems to be the unregulated business that has people in the industry as concerned as anything. Maybe AH and LA asked you guys to do this. Maybe get a little background on that, and then we'll get into what you found.
Sure. Catherine Luger and Vanessa Cinders and Rosanna Amata started talking to me about this idea, and they had heard increasing comments from hotel operators, particularly in major metropolitan areas in the U.S., that Airbnb is increasingly competitive with hotels. And I think the first thing is that the HNLA, for their membership, wanted to understand the nature and extent of Airbnb, but then also further understand how it's competitive and how it's gotten to be so competitive so quickly.
What was the source of the study to get this data? Because that's always amazing to me for you. I never use quite the right words, but professional educators that do a lot of research. It's like, where do you get the information?
Yeah.
I mean, for us, in our business, sometimes it's a matter of just getting on the phone and calling your customers. You can't, you don't have a source of all the information that you guys seem to have gathered. But how did you put these numbers together? Because there's some pretty darn good detail in the types of rooms and who's doing what for the time period. Maybe take us through that a little bit.
Yeah. It was slightly complicated, although hopefully after I explain it, it won't seem as complicated. But Airbnb would not provide the data to us. So unfortunately, it's not like STR where you can get market level data and either purchase it, or if you're part of the market, you actually get that in the course of your business. So Airbnb doesn't share data like that. But the AirDNA, which is a service provider to Airbnb operators, was ultimately the source of the data. And what AirDNA does is a continuous search of the Airbnb website. And their purpose of doing that is to assist Airbnb operators with making decisions about what units to offer, where to offer them, when to offer them, and at what price to offer them. So they provide data regarding all of those things, and so that was our source of data. And there had been previous studies that had focused on one market, usually New York City, and what we were interested in is looking at a broader picture of Airbnb around the country. And so we selected 12 metropolitan statistical areas, or MSAs, which represented the largest MSAs in the United States. And then our research partner was Colibri Labs, and Colibri took the AirDNA data and then parsed the data to take out aspects that we thought would not be competitive with hotels. So, for example, within Airbnb, there are individual units that are rented out, and sometimes it's small units, sometimes it's large apartments, sometimes it's entire homes. But then there's also shared rooms and shared apartments. And so what we asked Colibri to do was to remove all of the shared units, because we felt like that really would not be competitive with hotels. Now, there is some other work that was done, for example, by CBRE, where they included all of that, which tended to make Airbnb look a lot bigger than it really is from the perspective of a hotelier. I mean, from a hotelier's perspective, most of them don't really worry about competing with Airbnb doing shared rooms and the traditional couch surfing kind of stuff, because somebody who's going to do that is usually looking for a very low price point, and in a given market, that stuff just does not compete with hotels. So we asked Colibri to eliminate all of that at one end. At the other end, too, there are people who are going to Airbnb and similar providers, and they're looking for a really unique experience. They're looking for a tree house or a boat or something like that. Just last week, there was a story on the news, and Airbnb has been real good about getting stories out about their unique units. And there was, because of the big snowstorm in New York, somebody built an igloo in New York and was renting it out on Airbnb. We excluded all that stuff because that's something where we felt somebody's looking for a very unique experience, staying in an igloo in New York in the winter. And we didn't feel like that can compete with hotels either. So that's what Colibri did for us. They got all the non-competitive stuff out of there, and they were able to get data for a 13-month period from September 2014 through September 2015. And so we were able to then examine over 416,000 lines of data, which included over 9.5 million variables. And just to point out the contrast, Airbnb in its own study in New York City, which it released in December 2015, only included about 170,000 lines of data. So we looked at more data than anybody before that had looked at in terms of Airbnb. So even though we excluded a lot of stuff which we thought wasn't competitive with hotels, it's still a lot of data.
I noticed in the study, there's some pretty big numbers here. 378 million and change in revenue on the 2,675 full-time operators. Are those numbers just pertaining to the 12 cities you looked at, or is that extrapolated out to a national number?
No, that's a good question. Those are just for the 12 cities that we studied. So those numbers, and that number you cited is only for the full-time operators or people who are offering units 360 or more days a year. So the overall numbers are actually bigger than that.
Well, I think I think the big number was 1.3 billion in revenues for Airbnb. Is that correct?
Right,
and that's just for the 12 cities.
It's just for the 12 cities, and it's just for single units. So it doesn't include the couch surfing stuff. It doesn't include the unique stuff like the igloos, and it's only those 12 metropolitan statistical areas.
Is there any idea what the U.S. total Airbnb revenue is?
Well,
I know, like you said, it's private, but
yeah, we certainly know that Airbnb has a market value of about something like 24 billion. So it's a pretty big company. But we did just focus on these 12 metropolitan statistical areas. I would say, though, that it gets a large chunk of Airbnb demand, and because Airbnb it's everywhere, but in terms of volume, the cities, if you look at our data, cities like New York and Miami and Los Angeles and San Francisco are way bigger than even the other 8 cities in our sample. And so our sample includes a very large amount of Airbnb. So even though there's a lot of other Airbnb units out there, we included certainly the markets that are the most active Airbnb markets.
Right, right. So I mean, you're probably very close to the national total, because as you get down to smaller Airbnb markets, like a Louisville, where I am, the only time I really hear about it a lot is when you have big events like the Kentucky Derby, and then
that's right.
It becomes something that it's not right now in middle of February or early February.
Yeah, right. And that's what's interesting, because we see that. And what's notable about Airbnb, like in your case of Louisville and the Kentucky Derby, is that it's a very fluid supply. So when we picture it like hotels, that's probably not a good way to look at it, because it's not really like hotels where the supply is relatively fixed. The supply of Airbnb varies a lot, and even just month to month, because we looked at every single month over this period of our analysis, and the supply went way up in the summertime, for example. And we saw the supply went way up when the Pope visited Philadelphia, for example. And I'm sure if we were to look at Louisville and probably other parts of Kentucky, we'd see it go up with Kentucky Derby. And so, and in State College, I know the supply goes up every time there's a home football game at Penn State.
Right.
People are maybe living in those units at other times, and or in the summer maybe they're renting them out to students, but in the fall they make more money just renting them out a weekend at a time on Airbnb. So it varies a lot by market, but the key is that the supply is highly variable in Airbnb, and it's often based on demand, and that's where AirDNA comes into play, and that's why AirDNA was so helpful to us, because they helped us to really understand how the supply varies so much in Airbnb.
I don't know how much of this was in your report, but what are some of the ancillary, not ancillary, I mean, there are serious effects of this unregulated piece of our hotel industry. We all know that, they don't have the same ADA requirements. They don't have a lot of, workman's comp issues. There's just a long list of things. Was that covered at all within the study?
Yeah, well, I mean, what we found is exactly what you said, which is that they don't have the same ADA requirements as hotels. They don't have the same workers' comp requirements as hotels, and perhaps even more importantly, they don't have the same safety standards as hotels in terms of life safety. So, there are many places where Airbnb operators, hotels are required to have sprinklers, and they don't have sprinklers, for example. Mm-hmm. And so it's very different in a residential setting where somebody is very familiar with the layout of the facility, and maybe a smoke detector is considered enough for them to be safe in that given market. But for somebody who's just coming into an area for a few days and is unfamiliar with the area, as well as unfamiliar with the layout of the building where they're staying, that really may not be considered sufficient, and it's clearly an accident, or probably multiple accidents just waiting to happen. So they're not required to abide by the same standards in terms of all of those things. And then to even take it another step further, they're not required to pay hotel taxes in most cases as well. And there are cases now, San Francisco is a notable one, where there's effort to require Airbnb operators to pay hotel taxes, but there's not a good system for even finding them. So government officials have a difficult time regulating something that they can't even see. Right. So saying they have to pay hotel taxes and actually collecting them are two very different things. So for the most part, they're not paying hotel taxes either.
That may drive to regulation more than anything when the government agencies begin to look and see. I mean, I forget where I was most recently, but it seemed like I paid 15% on top of the bill for the transient tax, the state sales tax, and whatever. And in your numbers here, if you take San Francisco at $44 million. That's 6.6 million in revenues they're losing. Somebody is in the government.
That's right. In fact, we looked at it, and just for a 1-year period, and just in these 12 cities, and just for Airbnb, which includes home away and other types of things, it's well over $200 million in annual hotel taxes. And it's important to note that hotel taxes don't just fund things that benefit hotels like convention and visitors bureaus, but in many areas they fund safety like police officers and fire departments as well. So those
I would
things
think in that number
are not being funded.
Yeah, I would think in that number, John, you're including some state sales tax that definitely goes towards services provided to the citizens of that state beyond just the transient tax.
That's right.
If it's 1.3 billion, 10% of that's going to be 130 million. So that 200 million could easily be the total tax bill they would be paying. And of that, a big portion is going to go to the state, and a certain portion is going to go to the local transient tax that covers local issues and promotes tourism and whatever else that it might go towards. So it's a pretty big number that one would think they're eventually going to try to grab hold of it in some way.
Yeah, you would certainly think so, and that's a good point. It's that number that we cite includes all tax. Sometimes we generically call it hotel tax, but it's the tax that the guest pays at a hotel.
Right. Within the study, one of the questions I had, just looking at the numbers, some people may not care about this, but in your one key findings, you have little charts about the cities, and it shows New York 24% of the revenue, Miami 61% of the revenue. 61% of what revenue? Is that total hotel revenue in those cities?
So what we looked at was to what extent in each of the cities are large operators and full-time operators generating revenue. And essentially the punchline is that what we found is there's relatively few full-time operators and multi-unit operators in terms of numbers in each of these cities. There's way more people who are renting out one unit just sporadically throughout the year. However, what we found is that although they're low in numbers, these mega operators are generating a disproportionate share of the overall revenue. So, for example, on a national basis, only 16.8% of hosts are what we would call multi-unit operators, but they generate 39% of the revenue. So they represent a large and disproportionate share of the revenue. And so really these are commercial operators. These are people who found a new business model, and they're using the Airbnb platform to service it.
To rent their apartment building or something of that nature.
Yeah,
right.
and again, it's fluid, so it might be certain units in their apartment building at certain times, but these are multi-unit operators. It's not just one person who's trying to make ends meet and during special events renting out a room or something like that. These are people who are renting out full units. They're doing it throughout the year, and they're multiple units as well.
Well, and that seems like it might be the crux of the conclusion to this report is that the findings, because I think in the general public, everybody thinks of Airbnb being, the lady on Southern Parkway that has a 4-bedroom house and she uses half of it, and if she rents out 3 rooms or 2 rooms or even 1 room for some big event, that's Airbnb. Where it would appear this report has made a much bigger emphasis on those full-time hosts that are doing it on a all-year basis and multi-units at the same time, which looks like a good percentage of the total Airbnb revenues. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So on a national basis, it's about 39%. But there are places where those people are even greater. So, for example, in Miami, that's 62% of the overall revenue in Miami comes from multi-unit operators. And so there are some locations where those people are even more prominent than average. And so, and that's important that those aren't that lady who has the 4-bedroom house who's periodically renting out 1 or 2 bedrooms. That's that's not in that 62% in Miami. That 62%
Right.
is multi-unit operators, and so they're renting out entire units, and so they're generating a disproportionate share of the overall revenue. So, for example, if you look at the overall situation on a national basis, the full-time operators, these are people who are renting some number of units, 360 or more days a year, they're averaging $142,000 in annual income. So these aren't, small operators, because Airbnb has talked about people generating an average income like $5,000 or something like that. And that's if you include all the couch surfing stuff. But if you exclude that, the average is actually over $16,000. And if you include just the full-time operators, the average is over $142,000. And so the key is that what these people have established is a new business model. It's kind of like what we saw back in some other websites like eBay. eBay was originally designed to be consumers selling to other consumers. But what has happened is there's a few businesses that operate on eBay and generate a six-figure income every year. So it's not just a consumer periodically selling something to other consumers. And that's what's happened with Airbnb. I doubt the people who developed Airbnb thought they were creating a business model for somebody to make a six-figure income, but that's, in fact, what's happened.
What kind of fee does Airbnb get from their from these operations?
It varies
like
per
OTAs, where it's more, double-digit percentage.
It's generally lower than OTAs. So whereas OTAs might be charging 20 to 25%, the Airbnb fee usually is ranging between about 8 and 12%.
Okay.
And so that's important. So what we're looking at are the total revenue, because we're trying to compare apples to apples in terms of what does the guest pay. And so in that apples to apples comparison, we're saying that here's what these guests are paying, but that's the total payment. So that includes the fee to Airbnb, and it includes any other fees like cleaning fees, for example. But the fee to Airbnb of this total represents for each unit somewhere between about 8 and 12%.
Okay. We're about running out of time here. So what if you were presenting or standing in front of the HLA staff or board with this report, what would be your conclusion comments that you would give them as the essence of what you discovered?
Yeah, I think the essence of what we discovered is that multi-unit operators account for nearly 40% of the revenue on Airbnb, and it translates to about $500 million of the $1.3 billion in Airbnb revenues generated from whole units in the 12 major metropolitan statistical areas in that period between September 2014 and September 2015. So that's one way we looked at it, was multi-unit operators. The other way we looked at it was full-time hosts, and we found that a growing number of hosts are using the Airbnb platform to operate a full-time business, or nearly full-time, which we identify as 360 or more days out of the year, because that's comparable to hotels. A hotel room might be available 360 days out of the year, and then 5 days it's out of service for maintenance or deep cleaning. So in that apples-to-apples comparison, nearly 30% of Airbnb revenue was derived from this group of full-time hosts. And what we noted, too, is they're becoming bigger and more prominent. They're growing at a very, very fast rate. In fact, the overall growth year over year in Airbnb revenue is about 59%. And so it's very significant growth at Airbnb in general. But if you look at the Airbnb mega operators who are renting out 3 or more units, their growth year over year was 81%. So they're not only a disproportionate share, but they're growing at a disproportionate rate as well.
Here's a question that just came in. This $1.3 billion in Airbnb revenues, how does that relate to total hotel? I mean, this isn't part of the study, so you may not have the answer, but do you know what the total revenue is for the hotel industry and what percentage this represents?
Yeah, I can actually answer that, because one thing we did that we're actually working on right now, so we haven't done all these calculations yet, but I can give you a peek into this. We looked at STR data for the same MSAs, so for the same 12 MSAs, and we looked at overall occupied hotel rooms and overall revenue. The first thing is that it looks like for these units, the average daily rate is actually very close to the average daily rate for hotels. So I'll answer that first because I think that's probably part of the question, and then I'll answer the other part next. But in terms of total, the average daily rate for all these units was $157.67. Okay, so that's what the average person was paying within this $1.3 billion, $157.67. That's an Airbnb. Mm-hmm. And then if you look at the hotels in the same market, the overall hotel average daily rate was $161.04. So $161.04 is only slightly higher than the average rate paid on Airbnb. And in terms of the overall share of the market on average, the Airbnb percent of the supply in each of these 12 markets was about 2.6%. But Airbnb represented about 3.0% of the demand and about 2.9% of the overall revenue. So if we look at the lodging market as being everything, including conventional hotels and Airbnb, Airbnb represents somewhere around 3% of that total in these markets. And it's higher in some markets and it's lower in others. So markets where Airbnb is more developed, like New York, it represents a higher percentage of the total. And in markets where it's less developed, it's less than that. It's less than 3%.
Sure. But 3% is probably a good number to hang your hat on for the time being.
Yeah, so I think it's important to note that now, when you're looking at 59% growth, that suggests it was probably only 2% even just a year ago, and it may be 4 or 5% in another year. So it's a fast-growing part of the overall lodging market, but at least at the present time, it's relatively small. Now, 3% of the overall lodging market, that's more than most hotel brands, so it's still not tiny, and that's why you get over $1 billion. But it's not like it's 50% either.
Right. Well, John, we're really probably running out of time here. Gotten over our hour, which it's been very interesting, and appreciate very much your time to share with us and explain these reports. I'm sure for our listeners and those who will be watching or listening to this on the HBI website we'll enjoy hearing what you had to say, and we appreciate you being with us today. Thank you.
Thanks. Can I just say one more thing real quick?
Sure.
The person who first was my entree to Hotel Brokers International was Joe McCann. And as you know, Brandt, you currently serve as president of HBI, and years ago Joe was president of HBI as well. And unfortunately, Joe had cancer, and in fact, I was just at Joe's funeral over this past weekend in Philadelphia. So just wanted to give a shout out to Joe to say, Joe, we're going to miss you, and we appreciate all of his work on behalf of HBI and on behalf of the hospitality industry. He's been a great friend to HBI and to me personally.
Right. No, we concur with your comments. Thank you for mentioning it.
Yeah.
Okay, for the audience, don't forget to rate today's webcast by clicking on the Rate This button located at the top of the webcast player. We'd like to have your feedback. Let us know how we did today and whether these are the kind of topics you want to hear in the future. You can download the PDF list of today's featured hotel listings, plus a selection of additional hotel investment assets listed by HBI broker members under the Attachments button on the top of the webcast player. Click on the Share This button to share today's webinar with your colleagues, and remember that this and previous Hotel Investor Marketplace webcasts are available on our on-demand viewing at hbihotels.com. Before we go, we'd like to remind you of our industry calendar. HBI will be holding our annual meeting in Las Vegas February 17th and 18th. We'll be attending the Hunter Investors Conference in their trade show, exhibiting there on March 16th through 18th. And we'll also be exhibiting at the AHOA Annual Convention being held in Nashville on March 29th through April 1st. We'll be at booth 165. So come by and say hello if you're attending that. Let us know webinar. Thanks for joining us today, and everyone have a great day and rest of the week. Thank you.